back to Trade Links, brought to you by NatWest. My name is Tim Phillips. And welcome back to our regular panel of experts. Aastha Gupta, European economist, economics and markets strategy at NatWest Markets. Hello, Aastha. Welcome back.
Hi, Tim.
And also Scott Livingstone, international advisor, NatWest Group, a man fated to walk the earth in search of enlightenment on the world of geopolitics. Hello, Scott.
Good to be here.
Scott, last time you were in Helsinki. Where are you today?
I'm in Edinburgh, but bound for Frankfurt at this week's travel.
We're looking forward to seeing you back in London sometime. I just imagine the presents he's going to bring us, Aastha. We did have some communication after the last episode asking, well, we know who Aastha and Scott are. Who are you, Tim? And I think that's a fair question. So to fill you in, I'm a journalist and I've been writing about trade and economics for several decades now. And I have to say, there has never been so much interesting trade news, and it has never been so confusing. I'm in the privileged position to be able to ask all the things on my mind to our experts. And that means that if there is anything that you want to ask them, get in touch with me and we'll make sure that we include it in a future episode. A few weeks ago, we posted a question on LinkedIn and we asked, what do you want us to talk about? And the replies were overwhelmingly trade in technology. That's the raw materials, the components, and especially the supply chains. Well, you wanted it, you've got it, because our topic today is the tech trade. So, Aastha, let's start with those global supply chains the technology business relies on. What are they? And for what technologies, what sectors are they important?
We're really talking about intricate, invisible networks that span continents. So these are supply chains that bring us everything from smartphones, electric vehicles, to solar panels. And it's not just about moving goods. It's about how innovation, labor, and capital are distributed across the world. So take semiconductors. So designing a chip might happen in the US, the actual fabrication or manufacturing in Taiwan, and the assembly, packaging, and testing in Malaysia, Philippines, or China. And then that chip might end up in a server in Germany, or a phone assembled in Vietnam or India. And that's one supply chain for just one component that we're talking about. So these supply chains are crucial for AI, clean energy, telecommunications, and even defense for now. So even things like medical equipment rely on components from multiple countries. And what's fascinating is that the more advanced the tech, the more globalized the production tends to be, because no single country has all the capabilities. We're not really talking about shipping containers. We're talking about a system of deep interdependence. When that system gets disrupted, whether by a pandemic or geopolitics or export controls, it creates ripple effects across the global economy. And these effects have led to the recent tactical competition that we've seen, especially in technology.
Scott, when we discussed this recently, you mentioned to me that supply chains have become weaponized. Why did this happen? How has that happened?
If you're quoting me verbatim, I was probably too short term because I think supply chains had been weaponized since supply chains and geopolitics first came into being. From the Silk Roads to imperial powers to Cold War blockades. I mean, think of the blockade of Cuba, for example. I think you could point to plenty of examples over history where supply chains have been used to generate geopolitical influence or coercion or to build alliances. So I think if we're asking why have they become weaponized recently, we're probably missing one of the key points. They've been a crucial part of statecraft, the blending of hard and soft power to achieve national objectives. I think they've always been there. And I think it's all the essence of supply chains being weaponized has been the effort for states to exploit dependencies and monopolies or choke points, or indeed to escape from them. If the state perceives a weakness, then there will always be an effort from the state to try and find alternatives, to try and mitigate the weakness that they perceive. You can look through history and you can see that this type of statecraft using supply chains as a diplomatic tool usually comes in times of polarization or competition or indeed systemic change. And I think we've got all three of those components right now. We're seeing global polarization in terms of the future world order, where the direction of travel that's adding. We're seeing competition verging in conflict in plenty of theaters around the world. And then I would say systemic change. We're seeing a shift to either the global governance in terms of how the UN, for example, is functioning or not functioning. And then obviously systemic change in terms of technology. And that shift in technology really brings some supply chains, as Aastha has been saying, some really important emerging supply chains to the very top of what is strategically important.
Scott, it's entirely possible I was misquoting you right back at the beginning of these supply chains, these processes that Aastha was describing to us. The commodities, the ingredients of all these technology products. We hear a lot about rare earths at the moment, which are some of those commodities. And we're in an era where every country seems to be creating industrial policy around trade. How are they using this policy to control the supply of these commodities?
So, Tim, I'm of the view that the middle of the century, geopolitical power will hinge as much on any state's control or reliable use of technologies as it would do on the size of your military or the extent of your geographic boundaries. I think we do need to be viewing geopolitical power through a technology lens as well as those other ones. I think that realization has landed in capitals. And I think a bit of strategic thinking, you pretty quickly end up talking about dependencies. Mm-hmm. And in the light of what happened with the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we suddenly saw that, long globalized supply chains were vulnerable. Either they were fragile to accident or they were vulnerable to weaponization by a hostile entity. I think you put those two parts together and you realize that the future technology and the underpinning raw materials suddenly become absolutely vital for future power. And I think that's why we're seeing this focus on rare earths, because they do underpin much of the technology, as Aastha has been speaking about, from the energy transition to a low carbon energy or to modern vehicles and to modern weapons and compute power. So I'm particularly interested in a single entity, which is the use of what's called permanent magnets, so rare earth magnets.
Right, yeah.
And I think they're crucial because they feature in so many of these new aspects of technology. So I think that's one of the reasons why they've gone straight to the top of a geopolitical list of concerns.
We're absolutely living in a new era of industrial policy. It's playing out in real time across tech supply chains, especially when it comes to strategic commodities like rare earths. So countries are no longer just letting markets handle everything. Governments are stepping in to shape, secure, and sometimes controlling their access to the raw materials that are powering the key technologies, things like lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements that are essential for everything from electric vehicles, smartphones to fighter jets. So take China, for example, which controls about 60 to 70% of rare earth mining and over 80% of global processing.
Wow.
And it's not shy about using that leverage. We've seen export restrictions and licensing requirements, especially during periods of geopolitical tensions. The goal here is not economic, it's strategic. It's about controlling the choke points, as Scott earlier said. And in response, countries like the US, members of the EU, Japan, and even Australia have rolled out subsidies, strategic stockpiles, and public-private partnerships to build domestic or allied supply chains. And we're also seeing tax credits for domestic mining, investment in refining capacity, and new trade alliances which are focused especially on critical minerals. Like, for example, we have the Mineral Security Partnership. It's about resilience. Nations are using industrial policies to de-risk their supply chains and ensure that they have access to the materials that underpin next-gen tech. And it's rewriting the rulebook for global trade in commodities.
Earlier, we were talking about semiconductors, what economists call an intermediate good, aren't they? They've been manufactured, but they're still going to go into another manufacturing process somewhere further along that supply chain. Aastha, what are countries doing about controlling access and supply of semiconductors?
Things get really interesting because semiconductors, as you said, are the backbone of all modern tech, and it goes into everything that we touch and see and use in everyday life. And we're seeing an unprecedented push by governments to control access to chips and the components that make them. So the US is leading this with the CHIPS Act, which involves a $52 billion boost over 4 to 5 years to support domestic manufacturing and tough export controls that limit China's access to advanced chips and the tools to make them. Even Japan and Netherlands have joined in, restricting the export of key equipment like lithography machines. EU has also launched its own CHIPS Act to build resilience and reduce reliance on Asia. Countries are not just competing for market share, they're competing for control. The chips are the new oil, and everyone wants to secure their wealth.
We could spend a while talking about the tit for tat of the reciprocal measures that are being taken by the US and the West or by China. China has been imposing new export licenses or making things difficult to export. It's outright banned some exports of a couple of rare earths a few years ago. And there are breaking news all the time. So there's something here, but this is live. This is happening week in and week out. The news that caught my eye is the blacklisting by Taiwan of a number of Chinese manufacturing companies. Like you say, Tim, these are the companies that will absolutely fabricate devices using semiconductors. And for a while, Taiwanese foundries have been exporting semiconductors into China, and they've just stopped. These are not small companies that have been added to this blacklist. And so this is where a trade policy can very quickly become a geopolitical escalation. And this step is seen as escalatory. I'm spending a bit of this week keeping an eye on how does China respond to this. So I think my point here is this is happening in real time. There's an ongoing competition, and the mechanisms that they're using for the competition are the mechanisms that Aastha has so well described, really.
The things that are happening, like you've just described, at other times, this would have been huge news, and it almost gets lost in everything that's going on at the moment. Aastha, in your analysis, where do you see the biggest pinch points?
3 stand out for me. And these are places where if something goes wrong, the ripple effects would hit fast and wide. So first would be semiconductors, especially advanced chips. So Taiwan, especially the TSMC, which produces about 90% of the world's most advanced chips. And that's an enormous concentration risk. Any disruption here, whether from geopolitics or natural disaster, would hit everything from cars to AI. The second would be critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. So China dominates the processing of many of these, even if the raw materials are coming from elsewhere. The bottleneck isn't always about where the mining, but where the refining is happening. Third, I would say, is the key logistics routes, Red Sea, Panama Canal, or even the rail routes through Eastern Europe. Climate stress, conflict, geopolitical tensions have made these routes less reliable. We've seen how even a single ship stuck in the Suez Canal can throw off global schedules for weeks. We're really talking about concentration, too much dependence on too few places.
Governments, large manufacturers, they're desperately looking to find some resilience, that wiggle room to find like an additional supplier, that +1 strategy. Where can they ease these pinch points, and where are they a bit stuck?
Do you remember at the beginning I said there was a wake-up call about supply chains? I think there's been a wake-up call about the rare earths that Aastha's been talking about. When this wake-up call is the West effectively subcontracting the processing and to a degree the negotiations for concessions for the extraction of the minerals. But certainly in terms of processing, there was a policy approach to allow that to take place in China. And frankly, because they're very environmentally damaging, these are messy processes, and the West opted out, really. So as well as a sort of effort to regain some wriggle room, that comes with a challenge because, yes, there are efforts going on to find sovereign supplies. Canada's a good example, but also the Nordics, Australia. Oh, and guess what? Greenland, by the way.
Yes. I've heard of that country. Yes.
So, and we've had the Ukraine deal, although those minerals are still some way underground. But the point is here, it's all well and good opening up your mines and digging the stuff out the ground. It's the refining that's, again, as you said at the beginning, a long value chain here. And the refining needs to happen. And that comes with an environmental cost for European and Western governments. But that needs to happen. I mean, Joe Biden put something like 1.2 billion US into restarting domestic capabilities. And it's really a supply ecosystem. It's all well and good digging it out the ground. It's got to be processed. So I think step one is rebuilding sovereign supply ecosystems. Step two is stockpiling, and there are efforts going on now to stockpile. You'll see significant states put money against stockpiling of these rare earths so that there is at least an emergency strategic reserve. Thirdly, I think you'll see more efforts on recycling. The EU, for sure, is leaning into this space, that there are plenty of processed rare earths out there, and they're in equipment or batteries that have come to the end of their lives but can still be recovered. So I think we will see emphasis on recycling of technology moving forward. And then finally, I think we will also see countries leaning in to develop new tech, where the requirements for such components could be slimmer, new types of motors or turbines that really reduce. I mean, in a modern EV, there's something like 2 kilograms of rare earths.
Wow.
But in an industrial wind turbine, there's 600 kilograms of rare earths. And so any technological development that can reduce those numbers, obviously, it makes it less of a pinch point. And I think we'll see increasing research into new technology.
Well, I'm encouraged by what you say is being done around this, Scott, but I'm also slightly fearful of all the potential strategic weaknesses that both of you have identified. So you know what I'm going to ask, my usual question, good and bad scenarios looking 12, 18 months out. Aastha, you first of all.
It's very tough to predict with precision because there are a lot of moving parts. And obviously, trade is increasingly being shaped by geopolitics and the landscape is shifting fast.
Yeah.
But a positive scenario for me would be some progress on the supply chain diversification, where countries are already investing in alternate sources for critical inputs, like they're building up semiconductor capacity in US or Europe, or securing new lithium deals in Africa and South America. We could end up with relatively more resilient supply chains, which are also regionally little balanced. That would mean fewer shocks, more stability for both businesses and consumers. Now, the bad outcome would be if trade tensions escalate, especially between US and China, and if export controls tighten further or retaliatory restrictions expand into broader tech sectors, we could see a deepening of tech decoupling. That might translate into higher costs, fragmented standards, reduced innovations, as companies are forced to split supply chains and their research and developments between competing systems.
Scott, your bad scenarios are always slightly terrifying. So give me the good one first.
Well, I'm not going to say terribly much different from Aastha. I think she's right. So much hinges on US, China. And I am of the view that there are plenty of indicators out there that Xi and Trump want to deal. Indeed, I think there are plenty of indicators that we could see Xi and Trump meeting. There is a sort of diary appointment coming up at a meeting in late October, the APEC meeting, which they should both attend. That's a high likelihood. But I'm of the view that there are indicators that there's still a open-mindedness to have a bilateral meeting between the two, because I think President Trump is up for a deal and I think Xi is up for reducing tariffs. So there is something here. I think that would be a good scenario if we saw a reasonable deal emerge from that. The bad scenario, really weirdly enough, I'm going to say a bad geopolitical scenario, is where we all get distracted back onto hydrocarbons and away from talking about future tech and into the space. And clearly the hydrocarbon sort of bad scenario is a regional war in the Middle East. We've had quite a bit of turbulence recently with Iran. I don't think it's over yet. I think we need to continue to pay attention to tensions with Iran, because one of the levers they do have, as everyone now knows, is blocking the Straits of Hormuz. It may well be a low likelihood, but it's a very high impact should it happen.
You never let me down with the terrifying stuff, Scott. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to get distracted by hydrocarbons and talk about that a bit more after the break. Okay, guys, I wanted to talk to you about oil because we mentioned it last time we spoke, and truly it's in the gift of trade links that whenever we talk about something, then the news goes crazy about it, and everyone's been talking about the price of oil and the supply of oil ever since. Scott, what's been going on?
Well, I mentioned the Iranian tensions just before the break, Tim. I think we saw a short spike, but very quickly the risk calculations were downsized and the price dropped again. And the backdrop to this partly is a more sober assessment of the risk of this regional war that I've scared you with, that forecast, but also partly because OPEC production has gone up since April. There are a couple of reasons why that's probably the case. There's something about getting market share within the OPEC cartel, and there's even talk of more out to come later on this month. So there is an uptick in output that is keeping the prices low. And really, I don't think we've seen the return to peak Chinese demand. There's a sense that China demand has remained sluggish since the pandemic, and it hasn't really picked up. That is an indicator to look out for. If we do see China demand rising, that would have an impact on price. And then I think my final comment, and this is something, it's a hypothesis really, but I think most high producing countries, and OPEC in particular, they can see the future here. And the future that sometime this century is a much lower hydrocarbon society. So low carbon, energy transition, electrification of our requirements. And I think there is a sense that at a point in this century, we will see peak revenue from hydrocarbons. And what does that mean? I think it means get it out of the ground now, because the time to monetize this in the coming decade or so. So I think that's keeping price low.
Aastha, give me some of the background data behind this, the changes in the oil price, the trade patterns, the supply changes.
Historically, we've seen that events like the 1970s OPEC embargo or the 2008 price spike, that how sensitive the market is to disruptions and shifts in the global economic growth. So if you fast forward to today, 2025 has been a truly turbulent year for oil. And it's not just about prices, but the deeper shifts underneath them. At the start of the year, oil prices were soft, which were hovering around $70 a barrel. I'm talking about Brent crude prices, mostly because of oversupply situation. But by mid-year, things got shaky again. The tensions in the Middle East, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz, spooked the markets. Oil prices briefly spiked to around $79. They settled back once flows through the strait continued. Behind all this, the trade routes and partnerships are shifting. So Europe's buying more crude from the US and Guyana instead of Middle East. China is diversifying its suppliers. And it's not just about where oil is going. It's about how it is moving and at what cost. The market's on the edge, because if something truly disrupts the strait, prices could again skyrocket. But if demand keeps slowing or supply keeps outpacing, we could see oil dip below $60 again.
Scott, I remember a few decades ago, whenever OPEC met, it would make the national news. You would see them all sitting around the table waiting for what their pronouncement was. And a decade ago, we were talking about whether we had already reached peak oil and predicting that OPEC would lose their geopolitical influence. Has that indeed happened?
No, and a little bit. So I think no to the idea, have we seen peak oil? I think that's it. And the forecasts I'm seeing put that moment of, certainly in terms of peak revenue from oil, from hydrocarbons, sometime between 2035, 2065. But it's, we're not too many decades away. At most, there's a sort of broad consensus that peak oil revenue will take place. Has OPEC lost its influence? No, it may not dominate the 6 o'clock news as it once did, but I think it still really matters. And, and the evidence to that is, you can look at the American election, and I guarantee that in the midterms next year, the price of gas will be on the agenda in terms of political advantage or political campaigning. The price of oil really does matter politically. I think economically, the price of oil really matters. There are a number of fairly fragile oil-producing states where the price level has a crucial impact on the stability of the regime. Venezuela is a good example, Algeria perhaps another one. And then if you're trying to transform your economy, as Saudi Arabia is trying to do, with a view to being positioned for after peak oil, then the price currently matters. There's a reasonable estimate that in order to afford Vision 2030, this transformation program, then the Saudi government needs to see oil coming in at $80 a barrel, which clearly it isn't at the moment. So that will be putting pressure on the magnitude and the scale and the pace of that transformation program. Price matters. OPEC plus, including Russia, maybe lost some of its immediate daily news impact, but it hasn't gone. It hasn't lost all of its impact. It still really matters in this current age.
Aastha, does the data that you're tracking imply that OPEC still has its mojo?
I totally agree. Because a decade ago, when we talked about peak oil, we meant that we'd run out of supply. But today, it's more about peak demand. And that's a huge shift. I mean, the expectations was that as countries transitioned to renewable energy and electric vehicles, OPEC's geopolitical influence would fade. But that hasn't fully happened. It's not just about setting prices. And what's changed is that how they use that power. With demand growth slowing and supply more diverse, OPEC's strategy has become more defensive. It's about managing prices through production cuts rather than letting the market run hot. In my opinion, OPEC hasn't lost its geopolitical weight, but its influence has become a lot more tactical, more fragile, especially in a world where oil demand growth is no longer a given.
Okay, I want to ask you about another dimension of fragility, Aastha. There's another piece of wonderful 1970s geopolitics jargon, the petrodollar. Is the petrodollar under threat? This is what we hear now. Some people might need to understand what petrodollar is.
Not immediately, but the conversation is heating up. The petrodollar system, where basically oil is priced and traded globally in US dollars, has been a cornerstone of American economic influence since the 1970s. And it reinforces dollar dominance in the global finance and strengthens US leverage in energy and capital markets. Recently, though, there have been, signs of gradual pushback, wherein we've seen countries like China and Russia exploring alternatives, settling some oil trades in yuan or rubles, and promising bilateral energy deals outside the dollar system. Even the BRICS bloc has floated the idea of a common currency for trade. But the reality is that the US dollar still dominates because it's liquid, trusted, and backed by deep financial markets. And even the most oil exporting countries still prefer to hold dollar reserves. While there is a political will in certain pockets to challenge the petrodollar, the practical alternatives aren't yet strong enough. In the long term, yes, the system could evolve. Nobody can say that for sure. But for now, the petrodollar isn't collapsing. It's being slowly tested, but not replaced.
I think we might be returning to the dollar's status as a global reserve currency at some point. Okay, so what I want to know from both of you is something that's on your agenda that the rest of us might have missed.
As Everton, I could pick a number of things from sort of the agenda. There's stuff that's hovering on or below the radar. I could go for the BRICS meeting coming up in July about what really the posture that China in particular takes to contrast itself with how the world is viewing the Trump administration. I think that will be interesting coming up. But really at the moment, in geopolitical terms, Tim, I'm watching Syria. The importance for the region of where Syria goes in the coming months really is difficult to overestimate. It will reflect the influence of Iran in the region. It will signal the spread of Islamist terrorism in the region. And I think it will give a signal as to where Israel's sense of security is in the region, which is extremely important for wider issues. And there are some positive steps, Tim. We're seeing the US lifted economic sanctions. We had the Israeli National Security Advisor surprisingly declaring that he was in daily communications with Damascus. And there is talk of US brokered negotiations towards something that looks like normalization between Damascus and Jerusalem. And we're seeing a form of dialogue involving Turkey as they secure a peace with Kurdish separatists. So it's a complex part of the world, many trigger points of Middle East instability. And if Syria can hold this together and we can see an emergence of a pluralistic, stable and progressive in economic terms, Syria, then I think there could be some positive news coming out. But it's extremely fragile and could fall at a number of hurdles. But that's what I'll be watching.
We must hope for that outcome. Aastha, what's on your radar?
The two things that I'm going to be looking at are how trade is being reshaped by AI and climate policy, because AI is transforming logistics and customs behind the scenes. And it's also creating new digital divides where access to data and manipulation have become like a trade advantage. Secondly, there are climate tools like the climate border taxes that are adding a new layer of regulation, especially for carbon-intensive exports. So the future of trade is not just about goods, but it's also about algorithms and emissions.
It's a real education getting the chance to listen to you. So thank you very much, Aastha.
Thank you so much, Tim.
And Scott as well.
Thank you very much, Tim.
And thank you to all of you who are now regular listeners. Please follow us, tell your friends about us, and also leave us a review. And get in touch if there is something that you would like us to cover. But that's all for now. We will see you soon.